of minutes to give you some background to what we're going to be showcasing today. It's essentially a success story. It's essentially a success story showcase session, and I'm very pleased to be introducing you shortly to Lee Kemp, who you'll soon learn I've spent some years working with many years ago, and this is the first time that we've done anything in the same room apart from drinking for a long time, so I'm looking forward to hearing what he's got to share with you. Just to give you some brief introductions, although Lee's going to talk to you in much more detail about a big branded case study, this is my first personal experience speaking about something from the client side. It's been a really interesting journey for me. I spent most of my early career in film and video production. And for the very first time, I found myself on the client side of the table commissioning a promotional film for my own tech startup about a year ago. And I learned a lot about the experience for the customer, and it was a really revealing process that I kind of wish I'd done many years ago. So my background was originally involved in selling and producing corporate branded communication, just at about the time when the internet started to become one of the most interesting places for brands to put their content out over. And in that capacity, I worked with quite a few big brands, learned a huge amount about the sorts of communications objectives that go into their projects, but also about some of the challenges they were facing, increasingly with competition online reaching their audiences. And both case studies today have been absolutely dependent upon the content that's been produced actually reaching the audience it's intended for. These haven't been TV ads that have been transmitted during expensive primetime slots or corporate videos that have been played in meetings. They've both been pieces of content that have got to go out and find their audiences in order to have any chance of success. My personal project is a mobile payments platform called Droplet, which is changing the way the world uses money. And it was very important for us at an early stage in our beta to create a piece of content that was going to get out there and make people aware of the project in its very early stages, get our first few thousand users onto the platform. So video is a very key ingredient for us. And for Lee and I, as I said, worked together a few years ago, but he now runs Vermilion Films and produces content for a whole range of hugely impressive brands all around the world. I think you're about to get on your 27th flight this year, did you say? Is that true, or was that a lie? 23rd, okay, that's not too bad. And so Lee will talk to you about some of the overall themes and challenges, but specifically in the case of AGCO, $18 billion turnover manufacturer of agricultural equipment, a global business. And for something which is rooted in agriculture, hugely progressive in my opinion in the amount of stuff they've been trying out in the new world of the digital web. So I've now mentioned the internet a couple of times, and before we get into the detail of the case studies, I wanted to tell you about two or three thoughts that I have. Welcome, come in. And there'll be lots of chance for Q&A later. I wanted to tell you about two or three thoughts that I have about the context in which these two case studies have come into life. Because it's all very well talking about the technology of online video, but that's necessary, if not sufficient nowadays, for success. And there are some big overarching themes that I've seen emerge in general online marketing that are hugely relevant to video in the way they haven't been before at all. So there are some things we have to bear in mind now that we didn't have to think about at all 10 or even 5 years ago. 10 or 5 years ago, producing something which was vaguely non-soporific was sufficient to reach an audience because you were essentially paying to reach them and you had their almost undivided attention, particularly for corporate communications. Nowadays, everything is up against everything else on the web. So my three kind of cursory points about the context, the digital marketing context in which these two video case studies and the vast majority of branded communications sit are this. The first one is about the content itself and who it's aimed at and what it's actually trying to achieve. I remember when I was in the game of producing corporate communications and corporate video content, very rarely was anybody in any way interested about the audience. They were interested in how many of their corporate messages they could squeeze into one achingly boring voiceover script. And the audience was almost there as a kind of passive recipient of these messages. And nowadays, audiences are all in control in a way that we're not anymore. And even if they go to a show and get a free lunch and they're expected to watch a piece of corporate content, they still won't be paying attention unless it's utterly captivating. And there's a certain amount of that you can achieve with bells and whistles, but the real fundamental things that will achieve the success where an audience member actually wants to watch something and chooses to watch it all the way through are the sort of approach that you take in the way you design your content and who it's for. So if you produce content that is genuinely made for its intended audience, to make them better informed or entertained or interested in what you have to say, then I think that sort of content is absolutely essential for success. If you don't think about those things, you don't think about the things that are going to make your piece of video useful, interesting, or entertaining to your audience, I think you will always fail in whatever your objectives are. And those aren't sufficient. We need a lot of other tactics to help make it work. But that fundamental pretext is a really difficult thing, I think, for brands to get their heads around. And I like this diagram. This chart's from a sharing social video platform called ShareThrough. And if you can relate to this idea that on the left-hand side we have the TV ads of old and the kind of interruptive messaging that is trying to drive a command or an instruction. And as we move more and more towards the right, we start to discover this type of content that people are actively going out of their way to watch. And we have to recognize in this space, we're not the only game in town. We're competing with entertainment content producers, the video viral successes, independent auteurs who are becoming online video superstars. And in that malaise is an opportunity, a space where brands can also succeed. But they'll only succeed if the content they're producing is designed to make their audience interested, entertained, or better equipped to face the world, whatever it is they're trying to do. So as we move more and more towards the right-hand side of this diagram, we start to enter into a space that I call branded content, as opposed to commercials or advertising or corporate communications, corporate video. And when we get really at the far end of that extreme, I'm very wary of the word viral. And as somebody talking to you tomorrow about the nature of viral video, viral is not a property you can commission in a video. It's not something you can add to the brief, or we also want it to be a viral. But it is something which can be achieved as an effect of a successful video strategy. And all it means is that it's so entertaining or interesting or useful that people are happy and willing to circulate it amongst their social networks for you and help you reach a bigger and bigger audience. And in Lee's case study in particular, that was the mechanism by which his piece of content reached its audience. In my case study, it was much more about the traditional pay-per-view, but in Lee's, it was particularly dependent upon this objective of the content being so successful that people actually said, not only am I prepared to watch it, I'm also prepared to share it. That's wonderfully opportunistic because it means that for brands, you can actually get access to your audience without having to pay the sorts of costs per eyeball that we're used to paying in TV advertising. So that's my first point. My second sort of broad sweeping point is that distribution has now become just as important as content production. The end of the process used to be getting the thing on a DVD or a videotape. The end of the process then started to include a number of other digital deliverables. And I think nowadays that's only the beginning of the second half. The majority of the second half is now about thinking strategically about how you're going to get your content to your audience. And in both mine and Lee's case studies, we had to think strategically about how we were going to get our content in front of our audiences, and bearing in mind the previous slide about what it also had to deliver to them to get them to continue to watch it and share it. So seeing distribution as equally important to the production and design of the content itself, I think is important, in fact essential for any strategy, whether or not it's a huge, big branded campaign. I think even for a small piece of maybe even internal only content, thinking about how you are going to get your piece of content in front of your audience and differentiate itself in its presentation from the many other hundreds of messages they're receiving every single day is just as big a concern as whether the content you've produced is watchable, well lit, contains the right communications messages and all that sort of stuff. So when we talk about distribution, we can be talking about very, very practical things like the specific tactics and channels that we're going to use to reach perhaps our existing contact sphere. Or we could be going to the extremes of innovation and novelty, which are things like video seeding, where we recognize that we don't necessarily have the relationships with all the places that people go to watch video, and we have to employ the services of an agency or a third party to help get us there, to help our content reach those initial places where it's going to get its first viewers. And again, I think Lee will talk a bit about that as well. But there are big agencies out there, Unruly being one of them, who are probably the largest video distribution agency in the world, whose job it is simply to have relationships with lots of property owners, where those property owners have blogs or YouTube channels or other digital territories where they've already got hundreds, if not thousands of viewers, and Unruly's job is to pull a big handle at the beginning of your campaign and get your content out, to seed it out there amongst the first few hundred or first few thousand viewers, and then hope that in aiming for the first slide's objectives, being useful, interesting, or entertaining, those first few seeded viewers then go on and share it and help it reach its bigger, wider intended audience. So seeding is a brand new thing we didn't have to think about in corporate video 10 years ago. It's something which most brands, certainly people who produce corporate video, haven't had to think about. And now we're having to think about it. In fact, I think the things we're having to think about on both sides of the table, the agency or the producer and the client or the brand, are much, much closer than they've ever been before to the sorts of considerations that entertainment broadcasters think about. Entertainment broadcasters are trying to think about the sort of stuff that makes their content and their channel preferable to the others that are out there, and then the sorts of stuff that are going to keep people coming back and coming back for more and more. And therefore, they think as much about the content and whether it's going to be entertaining or factually interesting as they do how they program, where they promote, what their digital and mobile viewing channels look like. And on top of all that, of course, the aim of the broadcaster or the traditional media agency in terms of going out there and reaching, getting the circulation is just as relevant to us. So a lot of this stuff actually feels and looks a lot more like traditional PR, I think, than digital marketing, because this is all about the relationships with the journalists or the curated media site owners that we can reach out to, give our content to, and hope that they endorse it and introduce it to a new audience for us. The big prize on the back of this is, of course, the ability to reach hundreds of thousands of people for virtually no cost. That's the big prize. But it's a heavy expectation. It's a big challenging thing to overcome. And that's why we wanted to present you with two different size case studies of success, but certainly both successful on the terms they set out to achieve. And my third point generally about the context in which this kind of argument, this kind of discussion sits, is about data and the fact that nowadays, in the world of the web, we have more data, access to more data than we've ever had before in marketing communications. I think actually people who produce film for a living have very, very rarely been able to access any data at all. You know, we used to finish a product when we'd served it up on the aforementioned DVD or videotape, and we'd have conversations and arguments in an edit about what the right cut was and what exactly the right composition of that piece of content was, and then we'd see it as finished, and then we'd see it as sort of launched and delivered. Whereas nowadays, even a creative decision about what the right cut is of a film can be answered statistically. You can A/B test two different versions of a video edit and see which one delivers the most better results, or whether it's click-through conversion or simply viewer and sharing. So data is a kind of mixed blessing, because we can do things that we've never been able to do before, like discover in real time the answers to some of our questions about what makes good content. And even when it comes to distribution, understanding what the right or most optimal paths are for reaching our audiences. But it's also a huge challenge because there's so much of it, most of us don't know what we're doing with it. And if we're even on first base of actually capturing the information about how our video is being viewed, very rarely are we properly interrogating it to understand what that data is telling us. And even less frequently, reaching the third base of actually doing something different as a result of the insight we've gained. So the context in which on these online video projects now sits is akin to any type of content in the digital web. It faces many of the same challenges, but also big opportunities. And that presents, I think, a much more interesting playing field from which to choose how you approach this whole topic. So if you're in the business of content production, I think the world around you has changed a lot. If you're in the business of content commissioning and using content to further a brand message or a brand strategy, there's never been a more exciting time to tap into new talent, both creative, technical, and what I guess I'd call strategic, that can wrangle around all these different elements and make them all work together. But choosing the right things is very important too, and it all starts with good objectives, which we're going to mention in all three of these examples. So, in a second, I'm going to hand over to Lee. He's going to tell you his story. Before I do that, I wanted to share with you my first experience of being on the client side for the first time with my own product, my own video about a tech startup that I launched. And this tech startup is called Droplet. It's a mobile payments platform that lets you load money onto your phone and send payments to people for free. So it's the only system, certainly in the UK, that allows merchants to receive payments without any fees whatsoever, and it's a completely new way of doing money. And this is a big, exciting business. It's one which started in the rather strange place of Birmingham, up in the, I guess to you guys, the north of England. And we began our experiment with a beta just to understand if people would be prepared to try out this new way of making payments. So it was very important for us, with hugely limited resources, to get and capture and attract and activate the probably fairly small number of people in the city centre of Birmingham who had the equipment required, an iOS device, and the attitudes necessary, early adopter kind of people who were prepared to try new things, and get them to try it out and tell us what they thought. And of course, we didn't know who those people were. So I realised I was staring the answer in the face and had to eat my own dog food and use online video to solve this problem. And we decided we would commission a film and we would use a paid campaign to target very, very specifically the people we wanted to invite to take part in our beta, and hopefully convert them into downloading the app and signing up and trying it out. And it worked fiendishly well. The numbers were all very, very small, but so too was the target and the intended audience. And to me, it's a wonderfully articulate example of, well, it's a wonderful example of how articulate the web can be. Even though it's huge and vast and seemingly unnavigable, it can be also very, very good for achieving very, very specific tactical objectives. So our vision was to change the way the world uses money. We put together a short animated film, and it told our story, and it asked people to join and try it out. And I'm going to play you the film and then tell you what the numbers were that came out of the back of it.
It's sometimes said that not a lot happens in Birmingham, Britain's second city. But in fact, a quiet revolution is taking place, and it's happening right now. All over Birmingham, for the first time ever, thousands of people are sending payments to each other using their phones for free. Droplet is a totally new way of using money on your mobile. Instead of linking your phone to your bank account or storing your credit card details, Droplet handles payments completely outside of the traditional banking and card systems. You just download the app, top up in whichever way suits you best, and start sending payments. Reroute transactions over the internet, fully encrypted of course, so each payment is nothing more than a tiny piece of data. This gives you complete control of your money, with no charges for you or the people who receive your payments. You can also use Droplet to find new places in Birmingham, browse special offers from the merchants you love, and invite people in your social networks to join up, earning yourself reward balance to spend. Free money, just for sending an invitation. So, what started as a quick, easy way of paying for coffee is beginning to reboot the world of payments. Now everybody has the option of creating their very own secure economy, free of banks and fees. When you become part of the Droplet community, you'll be changing the way the world uses money. Download the app now, or if you have any questions, take a look around the site, or get in touch on Twitter. Droplet, powering a quiet revolution at the corner of your street.
And what staggered me about this campaign is that we were essentially about to try and plug this 2-minute video into an interrupted traditional linear environment of a YouTube pre-roll. That was our plan. And we had a sneaky feeling that although that's a bit of a difficult ask and a bit of a hard thing to imagine working in a world of highly elective, user-empowered choice, the one thing that I think was responsible for its success was the fact that it started with the words, "It's sometimes said that not a lot happens in Birmingham." And that was deliberate because that happens within the first 5 seconds, which is the part of the ad in YouTube that you can't skip. And so we launched this campaign. We ran this video over YouTube video ads. I'll get out of the way so you can see this. Over YouTube video ads, which I was amazed to discover you can self-serve within the AdWords platform. It's really hard to find. You have to go to campaigns and then drill down to the bottom left-hand corner. There's a little button that says video campaigns. And a credit card and a pulse is all you need to start a campaign on Google AdWords to drive viewers to your YouTube video. So we loaded up about 500 quid and uploaded the video and posted it on YouTube and then set up this campaign on AdWords. And we were incredibly restrictive in the criteria for its seeding. So we only wanted it to be served to people geographically within Birmingham, browsing on iOS 4 or above devices, because that's what we were requiring people to have in order to take part in the beta. And those were the criteria. We didn't set any keywords that wouldn't come up in any YouTube search results. It was only going to appear as the selected pre-roll when people in Birmingham were looking at any other video on their iPhone. Because that search criteria was so specific, the target bid price that was offered was incredibly low. I think we set it at about 20p maximum cost per view. It averaged out at just under 6 pence per view, which is incredibly small. And if we'd gone for a wider area, of course we'd have higher audience values, higher audience figures, but we'd also have had higher prices because the competition for those territories would be much higher. So incredibly specific, therefore incredibly cheap, 9p, not 6p. And that crunched out to be about 93 pence per click. So we had, for our £500, about 550 or so click-throughs to the App Store link where the video was directing people to. So we had, the headline numbers were 4,000 views on YouTube pre-roll in a week, very, very small numbers. But if you imagine the total addressable market within Birmingham for city centre moving iPhone 4 or above owning people prepared to watch more than 5 seconds of a pre-roll, 5,000 or 4,000 views is pretty staggering in my opinion, pretty successful. But the most important thing was that campaign earned us 500 downloads of our app, around about 25-30% of whom went on to become regular active users of our product. So for 500 quid, we bought ourselves a beta pilot. We bought ourselves all of the marketing communication relationships we needed to set up to get a meaningful number of people trying out our product and feeding back on it for the first time. And that was down to disruptively some very, very traditional principles of paying to get in front of an audience. And you might ask how this subscribes to my earlier mentioned vision of only making content that's interesting or relevant or interesting, useful or entertaining. I think primarily, although the tone of this was stylistically designed to be entertaining and lighthearted and exciting and interesting, the main thing that made that piece of content interesting to the people that we wanted to make it interesting to was the fact that it said it was all about Birmingham and it felt like it was something specifically made for them. So when they were invited to do something, they felt already engaged with the idea that we were presenting to them. So I was really pleased with this, utterly surprised, even more surprised that we got nearly 5% of people actually watched all the way through to the end of that 2-minute video. This wasn't a video they intended to watch. This is a video that was chucked up in front of something else that they were planning to watch, and nearly 5% of them watched it all the way through. And it bought us all the users we needed to start our story. And since then, it's gone incredibly well. We have over 3,500 users, 160 merchants in Birmingham. We've just started to release the product in London, and we'll be going big later on this summer. So it was a really fantastically timed piece of successful experience for us. And as I said, the first time that I'd sat on the brand or the customer side of the commissioning table, so a really rich learning experience for me when it comes to briefing a third party to produce a film for us. So that's me, and I now want to pass over to my esteemed friend and former colleague, I won't tell you why it was a former colleague, Lee, to tell you something about a bit of a larger case study and a slightly more significant brand experience that he had. Do you want to use that?
Yes, thank you. Hi, thanks for coming. So I'm going to fly through a 20-minute presentation in about 5 minutes. So I will skip over various parts and things like that. But I want to talk to you about a company called AGCO, who we've been working with for a few years now. A little bit about us. We are a film production company. We make films. Most of what we do helps people sell things in one way or the other. We sit at this fairly new intersection of film production, strategy and working out how you get the most out of your films, and ultimately the changing internet, or the evolving internet as we describe it. We try and sit on the kind of cutting edge of what's going on in the world. And we do this for AGCO, you probably won't have heard of, but Jaguar, Team Sky, Land Rover, Chivas, Polar, people like that. So relatively large brands doing relatively interesting work. So the client in this particular case is a company called AGCO, who I'm pretty sure you won't have ever heard of. They're a large American company, $9.62 billion in revenues, tens of thousands of employees. And they're a multi-brand global organization. They make tractors, obviously. Fendt, you probably wouldn't recognize. They're kind of the Audi of the tractor world. You might recognize Massey Ferguson, who are big red tractors that we see around the UK. They're a much more UK brand. They're the Ford, and a couple of others as well. Excuse me. So they have 4 whole goods brands and 1 parts brand. And it was the parts brand that we were working with in particular. And they have an interesting problem. They have a number of interesting problems, one of which is you only ever buy their goods when you need them. You don't kind of think to yourself, well, this weekend I'm going to treat myself to a new rear axle assembly, or I quite fancy a new exhaust for my tractor or something like that. It's, what's that noise? What's the smoke coming out of the engine? I need a new insert product. But the problem they've got is when they're advertising to their marketplace, the guys who actually make the tractors themselves don't like to show smoke coming out of the bonnet open, things falling out, oil, all that kind of stuff. So it's very difficult to market something when you need these big goods, and the big goods guys won't share them. Another interesting problem that you guys might find more interesting, they don't have a website. Massive global organization, literally no online presence whatsoever. If you go to the, say for example, if you go to the Massey Ferguson website, it's 3 or 4 clicks before you find anything to do with parts, and there is no AGCO parts website at all. There are no microsites. They have a YouTube channel in the same way that my godson has a YouTube channel. It's got his name on it and about 2 videos, and that's about it. So this isn't really what they do. And they also, you would assume that they are a B2C organization, or kind of B to very small b, something like that. And they are absolutely B2B all the way through. So they deal with dealerships. So they sell pretty much everything they do via tractor dealerships. And although you might think of farmers perhaps as a little bit parochial with a, stupid hat and straw coming out of the mouth and that kind of stuff, absolutely not true at all. You're talking about massive agribusinesses, 10,000 hectares, hundreds of staff. Lots of them are millions of pounds of turnover every year, buying hundreds of thousands of pounds of capital equipment. The dealerships are exactly the opposite. They are sheds with 5 tractors in, but they retain all of the information themselves. So AGCO don't have a huge amount of data about who their customers are, because all of that information is retained by the dealerships themselves. And what they generally have is through their sales force, dealing with customers directly, talking to dealers and things like that, but generally not a huge amount of it is shared. So what we've been working with AGCO for about 7 or 8 years now, and they did what they always do. They came to us and said, we'd like you to make us a film. And I said, brilliant, this is what I do for a living. Give me more business, I love it. And they said, but here's the brief. We want to talk to you guys about toughened glass. We want people who have had an accident in their tractor or they've had something smashed to replace their current cracked glass with the new toughened glass that we've got. So here's the brief, and here's our own response to that brief, which is kind of the equivalent of saying, well, we don't need your developers to do this because my cousin plays video games. It's the same sort of thing. It's kind of like, well, we'd much rather you didn't do your own creative work that often. But we kind of ran with it, and we did what we always do, and we said, how can we make this better? What can we apply from our skills and say, how would we improve this brief? How would we improve the response to this brief? And so we asked, ultimately, what are you trying to achieve? Which is the kind of thing, everybody ought to ask when they're going to give you some cash to do something for them. And what they wanted to achieve ultimately was to sell more glass. They wanted to sell more of their toughened glass, and not because our contact was particularly passionate about toughened glass or anything like that. They're a typical large corporate organization. They have a new product to sell. It filters down the chain to some point where it hits somebody who can't pass it off any further, and they get told, here's your product, here's your budget, here's your targets, here's your budget, and here's your rapidly approaching deadline at the speed of 1,000 gazelles. And it becomes one person's problem, and they can't shift it on any further. So we were working with that particular person, and as much as their target was, we want to sell more glass, ultimately they wanted to hit their targets, and they wanted to retain their job, and they wanted their boss to think well of them, and all these very human kind of emotions. And so what we worked with them around was, how do we get to the helping them sell more glass from the, here's a kind of marketing idea and a product that you want to sell. And what obviously, I'm sure everybody knows all of this, what they used to do in the old days, it was mostly to do with correlation. We did a huge amount of marketing activity. We sold all of these products over here. Ergo, they must be connected in some way in the middle. We did something right over here because all of this shifted. And we were very much about, well, how do we fill in that middle part of it and go, this activity we did over here, magical stuff happened here that we can measure, and we sold all of these products over here. So it's very much about measurement rather than correlation. And the most important question, and what I think differentiates us out of a film production company from a lot of other people, is the most important question is not, how can we make this video more interesting or more beautiful or be more impressive and just look amazing and all that kind of stuff. It's actually, what does the customer do immediately upon finishing watching our video? What's the first action that they take, and how do we measure that? And so when we talked to them, we said, what are you interested in? Well, they're interested in market awareness. They want more people to know about this product. But actually, what they don't have, you could have anything at all. What would it be? They said, we'd like to know who's buying the product. We'd like to have more customer data. So what I'm going to do now is very quickly show you the film. Well, I can't make it go any more quickly than it will, but it's only about 90 seconds long. And then I'll talk you through exactly how we did it. We're going to run over a little bit, but there's only a few more slides afterwards, and I'll explain exactly what we did and how we did it. So there we go. It's an impact. I'll put my teeth back in. It's an imperfect environment for watching it. Obviously, it's a little bit bright, but there we go. So what we did, what we were very much trying to achieve was creating content that would do something new and interesting and be ultimately shareable. There are a number of different shareable triggers, the reasons that people will share your content afterwards. We were aiming particularly for shock, a little bit of comedy, and also novelty, certainly in terms of there's not too many agricultural brands advertising in this way. And also, yeah, that's what I was going to say, novelty. So in terms of zombies, we were doing this kind of February, March last year. There was a slew of zombie stuff over the summer, but we were in there pretty early. I just want to get that in terms of creative defensiveness. So we did also quite a lot of seeding. So we paid a company, Unruly, to reach out to their contact network and make sure that our content was being seen by the right people. We were targeting automotive, we were targeting agriculture, and we were targeting horror as well. And what we did, obviously for automotive and agriculture, there's tractors in it, and there's the agricultural environment of farmers. In terms of horror, you won't have seen all of it, I don't think, but there were various cues in there for kind of hardcore zombie fans. There's obviously the chainsaw, which is an Evil Dead thing. The waitress is wearing a thing that says Barbara, which is a reference to the very first zombie movie ever, and various bits and bobs like that. Cricket bat from Shaun of the Dead. So all of these things where people who are into it would then go and share the content. Unruly, who we used for the seeding, they said basically, here are our targets that we think we can hit. This is how much it will cost, and they continue to promote the film until they've hit their targets. They estimated 2 to 3 weeks. They did it in 4 days, just in terms of, as I say, shock, comedy, novelty, all that kind of stuff was enough to get the word out and people begin to start sharing our content. We had our very own hashtag. Sounds, like the oldest thing in the world, but actually this is wildly unsophisticated stuff, really. We're not a massive organization. We're not spending huge amounts of money. We're just using the tools that are available so that we can measure things like public sentiment, where the video is being shared and all that kind of stuff. And because they had no website of their own, we appointed a digital agency to create a microsite for us, which is an unusual reversal. We're normally appointed by agencies to do work. Something like 47% of our work is in direct to client relationships, so we're in the enviable position of doing our own creative work quite a lot of the time, and also appointing agencies to do the things that we can't do. We are just films. And so what we were trying to achieve in terms of the microsite is that most important question, the next action, what happens afterwards. Really, there's only two things that you can do. One is share it, which is great, it gets the word out, increases awareness, but also is ultimately the end of that person's engagement. They're not really doing anything after they've shared it, apart from kind of gloating in the, I was the first person to find this thing, which doesn't last very long. But then we want them to actually take some kind of action and give them an option about what they might do. So we looked very closely at what we see as being the customer's journey. So if you follow my many arrows in my horribly complicated visual. So at the top, we are pouring in lots of views. We're using our seeding company to make sure we get lots of engagement and interest. This is being pushed onto YouTube. The two actions you can take, you can share it via various aspects of social media, or we can drag you across to our microsite, which is agcozombies.com. It existed for the sole purpose of housing this video. It was a responsive HTML5 website. The environment of the site changed around the film as it went on. The most important thing was we got to the end and we said, what do you want to happen next? Do you want the farmers to fight back against the zombies? Do you want the zombies to overrun? Do you want the dinosaurs to turn up? I was looking for a bigger visual effects budget at this stage. But we were giving people options, and what we were getting in return was we were asking for their customer data. So like I said before, wildly unsophisticated, but actually getting to exactly what the client wanted us to do, which was give them a list of names and email addresses that the salespeople can ring up and go, buy some glass. Ultimately, that's what we were after. How did the campaign go? So we released it at about 5 to 12 on a Tuesday. By the time my client went home at 5 o'clock, we had about 300 views. We were at 15,000 the next morning, 42,000 on the Friday, 84,000 on the Monday, and getting about 2,500 hits per hour. So, which was massively in excess of what we'd paid for the seeding company. They'd hit their target within the first 3 or 4 days, and we were continuing to roll by that stage. We were my number one's out a little bit. We were the number one automotive video on YouTube. Which is a measure of, it's not in terms of views, but in terms of pace of growth. So they divide into various segments. And so you have automotive, you have entertainment and stuff like that. Automotive, obviously a very big area. And we were number one at the end of the first week, which is fantastic. And the metrics we were putting in place, we were looking at share rate, we were looking at click-through rate, we were looking at conversion, which is ultimately the number of views versus the number of email addresses that we got. And we also looked at dwell time in the UK and the France, which is our two main markets. Particularly because people would have seen the vast majority of the film on YouTube, if not all of it. So any dwell time we got on the site itself was of particular interest to us. These were our benchmarks, 0.94%, 0.68%. Conversion is relatively low because it's a modern form of direct marketing. And dwell time, we had no benchmarks. It was the first time on this particular site. So what we got, our share rate was at 1.7, which is nearly twice as much. My maths was failing me for a second. Click-through rate was much higher. Conversion rate was 2.27%, which is amazing as far as we were concerned and the client was concerned. And even after watching a significant portion of the video on YouTube, they were still hanging around the site itself for close to a minute, which was just long enough to kind of read through, get what they needed from it, and then start handing over their very useful details. I think this is the fastest I've ever talked. So in terms of insights, like I said before, we're not doing anything particularly sophisticated. These are relatively easily accessible tools that we've got. We're now, obviously we have much more insight in terms of strategy and things like that, but there's no reason why most people couldn't do the vast majority of stuff like this on any campaign of their own that they're running. The way we got into it, this was the first time that our client had done anything like this, and we used kind of the crack model where we teased them in with a little bit and then got them addicted and just dragged them all in the rest of the way. By the end of the campaign, they were throwing money at seeding and building microsites and all that kind of stuff. But the temptation of having all of this useful data that they hadn't had previously was too much. It's all doable. They couldn't make the connection between putting their marketing materials out and getting customer data at the end. And we just put the bits in the middle. So I genuinely believe there is not a target that you cannot hit if you put the right tools in place. There isn't information that you can't find. And ultimately, it was relatively straightforward to define our own levels of success, work out what it was they were looking for, asking the right questions of the client to answer the things they didn't necessarily know themselves. Barriers to doing this kind of stuff well, it's the last slide, you can all go elsewhere. So clarity, understanding what we're trying to achieve. A lot of marketing goals are fairly woolly, I think, and people talk about, well, we want to get loads of hits on our website, which is, if you've ever read, there's a guy called Avinash Kaushik who writes about analytics and things like that. He describes hits as how idiots track success, because it has no real value. You can get 5 million people come to your website. If it's the wrong 5 million people, it doesn't matter. So clarity about what you're trying to achieve. Multi-platform is the enemy of creativity. That's a fairly contentious statement, but the more you try and so if you have an amazing idea that only works on mobile, and then somebody says, but we've got the main site, and obviously we want to have it on the main site as well, then that's half of your ideas gone. And every time you try and broaden the brief, you're taking out the interesting ideas around the edge. And so it's great if you can do lots of things on lots of different platforms, but you don't necessarily have to do everything. We were very, very lucky. We had very good clients. We had brave clients and interesting clients who were willing to kind of push the boundaries of what they could do normally. You don't see much zombie agricultural advertising. And also good agencies. There are lots of agencies out there that say they understand how the internet works. There are lots of agencies who say they do amazing creative work and all that kind of stuff. It's really interesting the number of briefs that we get through from agencies who say, we saw this cool thing last week and we want to do one of those. It's the most stunningly unoriginal conversation that I have an awful lot of time. So I think it's incumbent on clients to push their agencies really hard. And the last bit's a combination of curiosity and luck. Our client was really interested to know what would happen because they hadn't done it before, and they were interested to know how that would work. There's a man outside looking at his watch, so I'm going to tie it up here. And we were just lucky. Right place, right time, right clients, interested in what we had to say. And now, because of this, which was a big opening for us, we've been able to do much more of this kind of work. Any questions? Cool, thank you very much.